Well, thank you very much, and good evening. Let me begin by thanking the Christian Union for inviting me to participate in tonight's debate. It's been years since Jan and I were last in Ireland, and we were very delighted to receive the invitation. And it's also good to see Daniel Kame again tonight. Dr. Kame and I have interacted intellectually on this question previously, and I look forward to another stimulating and cordial exchange. Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to be defending two basic contentions. First, that there are good arguments to think that theism is true, and second, that there are not comparably good arguments to think that atheism is true. Now, I'll leave it up to Dr. Kame to present his arguments for atheism before I respond. In this opening speech, I want to sketch 5 reasons in favor of God's existence. As a professional philosopher, I think that God makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience, including philosophical, scientific, ethical, historical, and existential considerations. What are some of these data? Well, number one, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are powerful philosophical arguments as well as strong scientific evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never had a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But how could an infinite number of past events elapse one after another in order for today to arrive? That would be like trying to count down all the negative numbers ending at 0. That seems like an absurd task, since before you could count any number, you would already have to have counted an infinite number of prior numbers. And if you could count down from infinity, then why did you only finish today? Why not yesterday or the day before? At any point in the past, you've already had an infinite amount of time to finish your countdown, and therefore you should already be done. These sorts of absurdities suggest that an actually infinite past is impossible. Moreover, in one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 14 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that models which do not meet this one condition still fail for other reasons to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded none of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some point in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered quantum theory of gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. Either way, the universe began to exist. Since something cannot come into being out of nothing, the absolute beginning of the universe implies the existence of a transcendent cause of the universe. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore the universe has a transcendent cause. Now, from the very nature of the case, as the cause of space and time, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. Now, there are only two possible candidates that could fit such a description: either an abstract object, like a number, or an unembodied mind. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind. And thus we are brought not merely to an uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 2, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions in the Big Bang were fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with a precision and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. These constants are not determined by the laws of nature. Second, in addition to these constants, you find certain arbitrary quantities which are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the delicate life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life could not exist. We now know that life-prohibiting universes are incomprehensibly more probable than any life-permitting universe. Now, there are three possible explanations of this extraordinary fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, it can't be due to physical necessity because, as we've seen, the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. So, could the fine-tuning be due to chance? Well, the problem here is that the odds that all the constants and quantities would fall by chance into the tiny life-permitting zone are so infinitesimal that they cannot be reasonably faced. Therefore, the proponents of chance have been forced to recur to a remarkable metaphysical hypothesis: the multiverse. According to this hypothesis, there exists an infinite number of randomly ordered, unseen parallel universes, so that by chance alone, finely tuned universes would appear somewhere in the ensemble. There are many problems with the multiverse hypothesis as an explanation of fine-tuning, but let me highlight one of the most important. If our universe were just a random member of a multiverse, then we ought to be observing a much different universe than we do. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has pressed this objection forcefully. He points out that the odds of our universe's initial low entropy conditions existing by chance alone are 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. By contrast, the odds of our solar systems suddenly forming by the random collision of particles is 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 60. This number, says Penrose, is utter chicken feed in comparison with 10 to the 10 to the 123. What that means is that it is far more likely that we should be observing an orderly patch no larger than our solar system. For a universe like that is unfathomably more probable than a fine-tuned universe like ours. In fact, the most probable observable universe is one which consists of a single brain which fluctuates into existence by a random fluctuation with illusory perceptions of the external world. So, if you accept the multiverse hypothesis, you're obligated to believe that you are all that exists, and that this auditorium, your body, the earth, and everything you perceive are just illusions of your brain. No sane person believes such a thing. On atheism, therefore, it is highly improbable that there exists a randomly ordered multiverse. With the failure of the multiverse hypothesis, the alternative of chance collapses. Neither physical necessity nor chance provides a good explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. Therefore, the best explanation is design. And thus, the fine-tuning of the universe implies the existence of a designer of the cosmos. Number 3, the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world. Our first two arguments give us a creator and designer of the universe, but they don't tell us anything about his moral character. How can we know that he is good? My third argument addresses that question. Premise 1 states, if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined that it is advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, exhibit similar behavior for the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively binding and true. But that leads to our second premise. Objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. Now, that does not imply that our moral experience is infallible, but only that it is not wholly delusory. Our apprehension of the moral realm is analogous to our apprehension of the physical realm. Just as in the absence of some defeater, we are rational to accept the fallible deliverances of our senses, that there really is a world of physical objects around us, so too, in the absence of some defeater, we are rational to accept the deliverances of our moral apprehensions. And there is no such defeater. As philosopher Louise Anthony so nicely puts it, any argument for moral skepticism is going to be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves. Actions like the terrorist attacks in London yesterday aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. Some things, at least, are truly evil. But if any objective moral values and duties exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. Number 4, the historical facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. Historians have reached something of a consensus that Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, with the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come. And as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually three facts recognized by the majority of historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number one, on the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist, by far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number two, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent German New Testament critic Gert Lüdemann, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by unbelievers, skeptics, and even enemies. Fact number three, the original disciples suddenly came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. First century Jews had no belief in a Messiah who would be defeated and executed by his enemies. And Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. N.T. Wright, an eminent New Testament scholar, concludes, that is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these three great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. Finally, number five, the personal experience of God. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by personally experiencing him. This was the way that people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick explains, God was known to them as a dynamic will, interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm and life-giving sunshine. To them, God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experienced reality which gave significance to their lives. Now, if this is the case, then there's a danger that arguments for God could actually distract your attention from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. We mustn't so focus on the arguments that we fail to hear the voice of God speaking to our own heart. For those who listen, God becomes a personal reality in their lives. In conclusion, then, we've seen 5 good reasons to think that God exists. God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And God can be personally known and experienced. If Dr. Kane wants us to believe that God does not exist, then he must first tear down all 5 of the reasons that I presented, and then in their place build a case of his own to show that God does not exist. Unless and until he does that, I think that theism is the more plausible worldview.
Turn this off for the rest of the...
Sure. So it's, which one do I press? So it's that one to go to the next. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here to debate this most important of questions, and it's an honor to be sharing the stage with perhaps the world's foremost apologist for Christian theism. I've followed and admired Dr. Craig's work for several years now, and I'm looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be a vigorous exchange of ideas. I'd like to begin by saying something about why I'm here. I'm an atheist, and tonight I'll be arguing for atheism, but I'm not a committed atheist, and nor am I what's sometimes called an anti-theist, that is, someone who thinks not only is theism false, but positively harmful. I'm not a committed theist nor an anti-theist, because I don't regard atheism as a position that I'm particularly invested in, or as a position that I particularly want to hold or for other people to hold. On the contrary, I'd quite like to believe some version of theism. And there are quite a few other supernatural claims that I'd like to believe as well. For example, I'd particularly like to believe that I'll come back to life after my bodily death. In fact, I often find myself rather envying religious believers, and how wonderful it must be to sincerely believe that the universe is governed by an all-powerful, all-good creator, and most wonderful of all, that after death we're reunited for eternity with our loved ones. So being someone who would actually rather like to agree with Dr. Craig, I'm not here tonight because I have a desire to convince religious believers that they're wrong, even though I think they are. And I certainly have no expectation that at the end of tonight's debate, any religious believers in the audience, after hearing my arguments for atheism, are going to go home saying, "Silly me, God doesn't exist after all." Nor do I even have any real desire to be proved right. On the contrary, I'd actually rather like to be proved wrong. And it's because I quite like theism to be true, I suppose, that at various points in my life I've actively, and I think sincerely, tried to cultivate some form of religious belief. But despite my best efforts, despite being intellectually open to theism, despite a considerable amount of honest reflection on the various arguments for the existence of God, and despite, as I say, having a strong desire for theism to be true, I'm sorry to say that I've never found any of the arguments persuasive or had any kind of religious experience of the sort that might lead me to embrace some form of theism. Now these psychological facts about me, that I'm open to theism, that I fairly consider the evidence in its favour, and yet that I persist in a state of unbelief, actually suggest a rather simple but I think quite powerful argument for atheism. Why the cosmic game of hide and seek? Why would a loving God, who supposedly wants all human beings to enter into a personal relationship with him, remain hidden from someone who sincerely seeks him? If such a being exists, then surely you'd expect there to be no non-believers like me. That is, non-believers who, in John Schellenberg's words, are non-resistant to religious belief and indeed have actively striven to cultivate it. Now, if that's right, then the fact that there are non-resistant non-believers like me constitutes good evidence for the non-existence of such a being. Now, of course, Dr. Craig might say, that I can't have been sincere in my efforts to cultivate belief. But he really has no non-question begging reason to back those sorts of claims up. And by that I mean that the only way he could reasonably deny that I'm in a state of non-resistant non-belief would be to beg the question by assuming from the outset that God exists, and that since God's existence is incompatible with the existence of non-resistant non-believers, it must be the case that all non-belief is actually resistant non-belief. Now, I think it would be reasonable to suppose that some non-believers are resistant to religious belief, and so whether consciously or unconsciously hide from themselves the reasons that might be adduced in support of religious belief. But Dr. Craig would need to make the much stronger claim that all non-believers, including those like me who claim to be open to theism, are in fact in a state of rebellion, that is, as having consciously or unconsciously chosen to close the door on the possibility of a relationship with God. Now, I think that would be an implausibly strong claim for which there's no non-question begging evidence. The fact is that there are lots of people like me who claim to be open to theism but are nonetheless non-believers, and I can think of no reason why we shouldn't take the testimony of non-resistant non-believers on face value. Alternatively, Dr. Craig might say that I haven't properly engaged with the arguments, or as he undoubtedly would claim, that I've made a mistake in my assessment of them. Dr. Craig obviously thinks that there are numerous sound arguments for God's existence, and since he regards those arguments as sound, he must think that anyone who's unpersuaded by them has made some kind of rational mistake. They must be rationally dysfunctional in some way. But as Dr. Craig himself is well aware, it's not only through the provision of external evidence and argument that God could make himself known to the non-resistant non-believer. As an omnipotent being, it would be an absolute cinch for him to provide me with direct experiential knowledge of his reality. And yet he chooses not to do so. So one of the things that I'd like to hear from Dr. Craig tonight is a plausible, non-question begging explanation as to why God hasn't revealed himself to me and others like me. Now, Dr. Craig might say that while there are non-resistant non-believers like me, it's only a matter of time before God reveals himself. So in his podcast, Dr. Craig's podcast, not God's podcast, he's argued that the kind of non-resistant non-belief that I ascribe to myself is not incompatible with the existence of God. What is incompatible with the existence of God is what he calls persistent non-resistant non-belief. That is, non-resistant belief that persists until death. So on Dr. Craig's view, if my characterization of my non-belief as non-resistant is accurate, then at some point prior to my death, God will reveal himself to me. And my response to this would simply be to ask Dr. Craig, why hasn't God already revealed himself to me? And surely given God's perfectly loving nature, and given that my coming into a personal relationship with God is supposedly the greatest good for me, you'd expect God, as an all-powerful, all-loving being, not to delay in delivering that great good to me. What would we think of a parent who said, I'm not going to have anything to do with my child for the first 40 years of his life? Well, we'd obviously be inclined to say that they fell short as a parent and that their love for their child was imperfect. So in other words, I think that Dr. Craig's attempt to sidestep the problem posed by non-resistant non-belief, but by saying that while temporary non-resistant non-belief is compatible with theism, persistent non-resistant non-belief is not compatible with theism, does nothing to mitigate the problem, since any kind of non-resistant non-belief, whether temporary or persistent, is incompatible with the existence of an omnipotent, perfectly loving being. Okay, I'd now like to say something about the argument from evil and why I think it provides good reasons for believing atheism to be true. Now, the argument from evil is, of course, an ancient argument, so I make no claim to originality here. In its simplest form, it asserts that since God is omnipotent and morally perfect, he should be both able and willing to prevent evil. Since there is evil in the world, such a being cannot or is unlikely to exist. Now, one of the traditional theistic responses to this sort of argument is to claim that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil to occur, because evil is necessary for the existence of what are called outweighing goods. For example, courage, which we value, is only possible in a situation in which there is fear. Sympathy, which we value, is only possible in a situation in which there is suffering. Dignity in the face of adversity is only possible in a situation in which there is suffering. Now, I've never found this kind of response very persuasive, primarily because it's just highly implausible that the so-called outweighing goods really do outweigh the evils that make them possible. I mean, are we really supposed to believe that the evil of a small child dying of leukemia is outweighed by the sympathy that's expressed to the grieving parents, or by the fact that the parents are brought closer together by their shared suffering? Now, Dr. Craig might say that this is an emotional, not an intellectual reaction to such evils, but it seems to me that the strong emotional reaction such events or occurrences elicit is telling us something, that our emotions are in effect functioning cognitively here, and that this is exactly the kind of feature of our moral experience that Dr. Craig appeals to in the context of his moral argument when he says that we apprehend objective moral values in moral experience. That is, that we just see immediately that something is good or evil. But even if you think these evils really do outweigh the evils which make them possible, you're still going to be left with the problem of accounting for all the evil in the world that can't plausibly be said to be necessary for the achievement of some outweighing good. That's to say, there's plenty of evil in the world that appears to be entirely pointless or gratuitous. Let's say that an evil is pointless if and only if God lacks a morally sufficient reason for allowing it to occur. And let's say further that God lacks a morally sufficient reason for allowing an evil to occur, even only if he could have prevented it without thereby losing out on some outweighing good or preventing some equally bad or worse evil. So examples of pointless evil are an animal's dying an agonizing death in a forest fire, a baby that's born with a terminal illness that endures intense suffering and then dies after only a few days of life, a tsunami that wipes out many thousands of people like the one that struck Southeast Asia on Boxing Day 2004 and killed in excess of 230,000. There's a profusion of apparently pointless evil in the world, from which, as I now want to claim, it follows that God probably does not exist. This argument, the argument from pointless evil, can be stated as follows. Premise 1, necessarily, if God exists, there are no pointless evils. Premise 2, probably there are pointless evils. Therefore, conclusion, probably God does not exist. As an instance of modus tollens, this is a logically valid argument. That's to say the conclusion follows from the premises. Whether the conclusion is true, therefore, hinges on the truth of the premises. Now, the truth of premise 1 follows a priori from God's omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. If God exists, then since he's morally perfect, he wouldn't act or fail to act unless he has a morally sufficient reason for doing so. And since he's omnipotent and omniscient, he'd be able to prevent any evil which isn't necessary for the achievement of an outweighing good or the avoidance of an equally bad or worse evil. It follows that if an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being exists, there are no pointless evils. What about the second premise? Do pointless evils really exist? Well, the first thing I want to say about this premise is that it's meant to be a probabilistic claim. That's to say, I'm not claiming that we can know with certainty of any instance of apparently pointless evil that it really is pointless. That's because with respect to any instance of apparently pointless evil, it's always going to be possible to say that it's logically possible that that instance of apparently pointless suffering was in fact, contrary to appearances, necessary for the achievement of some outweighing good, of which we're unaware. Some outweighing goods are easily identifiable for us. So, for example, the good of health that is achieved through some painful medical procedure. But it might be the case that the outweighing goods of which we're aware are not exhaustive of the outweighing goods that there are. Perhaps there are outweighing goods that are entirely cognitively inaccessible to us. And perhaps what appear to us to be pointless evils are in fact necessary for those outweighing goods of which we're unaware. And this response would be fine to the logical argument from evil, which claims that God and evil are logically incompatible. The mere logical possibility that what appear to us to be pointless evils are in fact necessary for the achievement of outweighing goods of which we're unaware is enough to show that God and evil are logically compatible. But I'm not claiming that God and evil are logically incompatible. I'm claiming that the existence of what appear to us to be pointless evils means that God probably doesn't exist. And the conclusion that God probably doesn't exist is probabilistic precisely because the claim that pointless evils exist is probabilistic. So I'm not claiming that we can know with certainty that there are pointless evils. I'm only claiming that we can know that it's probably the case that there are pointless evils. And that, in conjunction with the truth of premise 1, is enough to establish the conclusion that God probably doesn't exist. So, what reasons are there for regarding premise 2 as true? Well, first, there's the fact that it appears to us that certain evils are pointless. That's to say, there are evils for which, even after very careful consideration, we can't discern any morally sufficient reason why God would allow them. Now, Dr. Craig standardly responds to this line of argument by claiming that human cognitive faculties are just too limited for us to be able to reasonably expect that we'd be able to fathom God's morally sufficient reasons for allowing apparently pointless suffering. Given the vast distance between the human mind and God's mind, it just isn't reasonable to suppose that if God had a morally sufficient reason for permitting apparently pointless suffering, we'd be able to detect it. The fact that we can't detect God's morally sufficient reason only counts as a good reason for believing that God lacks such reasons if we have good reason for thinking we'd be able to detect his morally sufficient reason if he had one. And according to Dr. Craig, we don't have good reason for thinking we'd be able to detect God's morally sufficient reason if he had one. Now, at this point in his argument, Dr. Craig likes to invoke an analogy with chaos theory. Just as a butterfly flapping its wings in West Africa can set in motion a causal chain that leads to a hurricane over the Atlantic, so too, quote, the brutal murder of an innocent man or a child's dying of leukemia could produce a sort of ripple effect through history, such that God's morally sufficient reason for permitting it might not emerge until centuries later and perhaps in another land. When you think of God's providence over the whole of history, I think you can see how hopeless it is for limited observers to speculate on the probability that God could have a morally sufficient reason for permitting a certain evil. We're just not in a good position to assess such probabilities. Now, it's true that a child dying of leukemia might have a ripple effect, and it's also true that we're not in a good position to assess such probabilities. But obviously that cuts both ways. For all we know, the child dying of leukemia has no morally significant ripple effect. Or it might have a ripple effect that leads not to some outweighing good, but to further evil, perhaps even to a greater evil. Or it might lead to a ripple effect that has some good consequences, but not enough to constitute an outweighing good. So, putting this a bit more formally, we can say that assuming that all events have a ripple effect, in respect of any instance of apparently pointless evil E, one of the following four propositions must be true. 1, E has a ripple effect leading to an outweighing good or the prevention of an equally bad or worse evil. 2, E has a ripple effect leading to a non-outweighing good. 3, E has a ripple effect leading to further evil. And 4, E has a ripple effect that is morally neutral. Now note that of these four possibilities, we can say that E is not a pointless evil if and only if 1 is true. So unless 1 is true, E is a pointless evil. Now, since by Dr. Craig's own admission we are not in a position to assess the probabilities, it follows that 1 to 4 are equiprobable propositions. That is, each of the four possibilities has a probability of 1/4. Now, as I said, E is not a pointless evil if and only if 1 is true, from which it follows that the probability that E is not a pointless evil is 1/4, and the probability that E is a pointless evil is 3/4. Therefore, it's more probable than not that E is a pointless evil, therefore probably God does not exist. That completes my positive case for atheism. Obviously, I haven't said anything yet in response to Dr. Craig's own arguments, but I'll explain why I don't think any of them is successful in the first and second rebuttals. In Dr. Craig's rebuttal, as I said, I'm hoping that he'll be able to provide me with a non-question begging explanation of why God doesn't reveal himself to me as a non-resistant non-believer. I'm also hoping to hear from Dr. Craig in his response to my argument from pointless evil, how, given his view that we're ignorant of the relevant probabilities of the ripple effects of apparently pointless evil, he thinks he can avoid the implication of that view that with respect to any instance of apparently pointless evil, it's more probable than not that it's not just an apparently pointless evil, but an actually pointless evil, from which, as I've argued, it follows that God probably doesn't exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the next phase, which is the first rebuttal. So I'd invite Dr. Craig to speak for 12 minutes.
Dr. Came has not yet engaged any of my positive reasons to believe in God exists, and I would suggest that even if his arguments succeed in showing some improbability in God's existence, it's simply outweighed by the 5 arguments that I presented for God's existence. But do his arguments, in fact, show that it's improbable that God exists? Well, as I see it, he has 2 basic arguments. First, one from the hiddenness of God, and secondly, one from the evil in the world. With respect to divine hiddenness, I think it's important to understand that God's primary aim is to draw people into a saving love relationship with himself, not just to convince people that God exists. If that's all that God were interested in, then he could certainly have made his existence more obvious. For example, he could have written God exists in the stars or planted a neon cross in the sky saying Jesus saves. But there's no guarantee at all that in such a world this sort of display would draw more people into a saving love relationship with God. In fact, it might even have the opposite effect. After a while, people might begin to chafe under the brazen advertisements of their Creator and not to love him. The Bible says that God has provided sufficient evidence of his reality in nature and conscience, and by his Holy Spirit draws all persons to himself. As an omniscient being, he knows what would be most effective in drawing people freely into a saving love relationship with himself. What the atheist would have to prove is that a clearer revelation of God's existence would be more effective in drawing people freely into a saving love relationship than the way that God has in fact chosen, and that is pure speculation. Thus, there's simply no basis for thinking that divine hiddenness is an argument against God's existence. I might note as well that this really isn't an argument for atheism. It's an argument for universalism. It's to say that all persons should be saved. So even if you found the argument persuasive, it doesn't prove that God does not exist. It would just prove universalism is true. Well, what about then the problem of evil? Does evil disprove God's existence? Well, I think Dr. Came admits that the logical version of the problem of evil is a failure. The atheist cannot prove that there is a logical incompatibility between the propositions God exists and evil exists. In order to show this, he would have to demonstrate that it is necessarily true that if God is all-powerful, he can create just any world that he wants, and if God is all good, then he would create a world without evil. And those propositions are not necessarily true. They lay a burden of proof on the atheist which no one has been able to sustain. In fact, as long as it's even possible that God would have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world, then it's possible that God and the evil in the world coexist. And so for this reason, the logical version of the problem of evil has been widely recognized by theist and atheist alike as bankrupt, Peter van Inwagen, a prominent Christian philosopher, says it used to be held that evil was incompatible with the existence of God, that no possible world contained both God and evil. So far as I am able to tell, this thesis is no longer defended. So the question then is, does the evil in the world render God's existence improbable, if not impossible? Well, here I will simply defend the view that Dr. Kame already sketched, that given our cognitive limitations, we are simply not in a position to say with any sort of confidence, when some incidence of evil occurs, that God probably doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for permitting this. William Alston, in his article in Philosophical Perspectives, lists 6 such cognitive limitations which make it in principle impossible for us to make these kinds of probabilistic judgments. He says it is in principle impossible for us to be justified in supposing that God does not have sufficient reasons for permitting evil that are unknown to us. Take, for example, the illustration of the historical ripple effect. God's morally sufficient reason for permitting some evil to enter your life might not emerge until centuries from now, maybe in another country. When you think about the control of a provident God over the whole of human history, who sees the end from the beginning, you can see how hopeless it is for us finite, historically limited observers to speculate upon whether or not God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting some incident of suffering to enter our lives. So Alston says the judgments required by the probabilistic version of the problem of evil are of a very special and extraordinarily ambitious type, and our cognitive capacities are not equal to this one. We are simply not in a position to justifiably assert that God would have no sufficient reason for permitting evil. And if that is right, he says, the probabilistic argument from evil is in no better shape than the late lamented logical argument from evil. Now, Dr. Kame has a very interesting response to this consideration in his opening speech. He points out that there are 4 different possibilities that an event might have through the ripple effect it sends through history. It could make the evil worse, it could be morally neutral, it could have an outweighing good. Now, he concludes from that that therefore the probability of its having an outweighing good is only 1/4. That's logically fallacious. That argument violates probability theory. Consider a bag of marbles, and you don't know the color of the marbles in the bag. You might think, well, if I pick a marble from the bag, there's a 50% chance that it's red and a 50% chance it's not red, and so the chance of picking a red marble are 50%. Well, that's obviously fallacious because it could be blue marbles in the bag or green marbles in the bag. You simply cannot make any sort of probability estimate based upon that kind of blind calculation. Similarly here, there's no reason to think that the probability of the outweighing good is 1/4 or 25%. And this is particularly true if the world is under the providential control of an omnipotent and loving God who orders the universe so that evils have outweighing goods. It's not a matter of random chance. The hypothesis of theism is that God is in control of human history and so orders the world so that he has morally sufficient reasons for the evils that occur. So when we see an incident of evil in our lives, we have no idea of what its impact will be upon the world. Those probabilities are simply inscrutable, and therefore you cannot say either way whether that evil has an outweighing good or makes things worse. And if that's the case, then the atheist argument from evil fails. Because remember, he has the burden of proof to show that it is improbable that God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting that evil. And he's not been able to shoulder that burden of proof. He's making probability judgments that are way beyond our capacity to make with any confidence. Finally, the third point I wanted to make in this regard is that evil actually proves God's existence. Yes, I think there's a good argument for God from evil. It goes like this. Premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore, objective moral values exist. Some things are evil, therefore God exists. So while on a superficial level, evil might seem to call into question God's existence, on a deeper philosophical level, evil actually proves God's existence, because in the absence of God, nothing would be good or evil as such. And therefore, I'm not persuaded that the arguments from the evil in the world are at all compelling. Evil in the world is not logically incompatible with God's existence, and we're not in any position to say with any sort of confidence that the evils in the world are improbable with respect to God's existence. When we consider then the good arguments that we do have for God's existence, I think it becomes quite probable that God does exist, and that therefore theism remains the more plausible and probable worldview.
Thank you very much. And I now invite Dr. King to make this first rebuttal.
So many of Dr. Craig's arguments for theism are what's called inference to the best explanation arguments. That's to say, they take some difficult to account for phenomenon, such as the fine-tuning of the universe, the existence of objective moral values and duties and so on, and then argue that naturalism or physicalism can't account for that phenomenon, but that theism can account for it. So there are two general points that I want to make about this style of argument that Dr. Craig deploys. First of all, Dr. Craig usually makes the claim that the non-theistic explanations fail to account for the relevant phenomenon without really engaging with any of those explanations. For example, in the context of his moral argument, all we've been told, in effect, this evening is that there's no space for objective moral values in the naturalistic world of quarks and electrons. But this is just a bald assertion, right? And it ignores the many naturalistic theories of moral realism that are out there. So most contemporary moral realists, or rather, most contemporary moral philosophers are moral realists. And most contemporary moral philosophers are also atheists. So Dr. Craig is completely out of step with the majority of contemporary moral philosophers when he asserts that God is the only possible ontological foundation for objective moral values. And that's not to say that the contemporary moral realists are right, it's just to say that Dr. Craig owes us an argument as to why they aren't right. Now, of course, it wouldn't be fair to demand of Dr. Craig that in the course of tonight's debate that he refute each of the vast number of naturalistic theories of moral realism that are out there. But Dr. Craig's position is usually not just that there is no good naturalistic explanation of the relevant phenomenon, but that there could be no naturalistic explanation of the relevant phenomenon. In other words, he holds that there's an in-principle reason why naturalism can't account for the phenomenon in question. That seems to be his position on objective moral values. So, in effect, Dr. Craig seems to say that either one is a theist, in which case one is somehow supposed to be able to ground objective moral values in God, or one is an atheist and therefore forced to embrace some form of moral nihilism. Similarly, in respect of the origins of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, either one accepts theism, in which case all of those phenomena are supposedly readily explicable, or one is a naturalist, in which case those phenomena are supposedly recalcitrant to explanation. So given that Dr. Craig seems to think that there's an in-principle reason why these various phenomena can't be explained naturalistically, he doesn't need to refute each of the various naturalistic theories that are out there. All he needs to do is tell us why there could be no naturalistic explanation of these various phenomena, which he claims can't be adequately explained by naturalism, but can be adequately explained only by theism. And until he does that, he's failed in his epistemic duty, and those naturalistic positions remain viable explanatory options of the relevant phenomena. And in any case, even if it were true that those various phenomena can't be explained in terms of naturalism, that fact alone wouldn't provide any positive evidence for the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing personal agent. That a given phenomenon can't be explained naturalistically implies only that some form of non-naturalism must be true. It doesn't imply that theism is true. The second point I want to make about Dr. Craig's inference to the best explanation arguments is that seeking to explain any natural phenomenon by saying God did it is no explanation at all. How did God do it? How did it work? Dr. Craig wants the theistic hypothesis to play the role of a physical theory that can explain things. He wants the theistic hypothesis to be considered among the live explanatory options for a whole range of physical and psychological phenomena that cosmologists and neuroscientists are busy trying to explain in naturalistic terms. Well, that means that the theistic hypothesis needs to meet the same criteria of explanatory adequacy that would be applied to a scientific hypothesis. That is, it should be judged in the same terms that we use to judge scientific hypotheses. And when judged in these terms, the God hypothesis doesn't do very well. A scientific explanation doesn't just tell you that something happened, it tells you how it happened. It identifies a sequence of events and a causal mechanism. The Big Bang theory, for example, doesn't just tell us that the universe started in a Big Bang, full stop. It gives us a timeline for the metric expansion of the universe that offers detailed measurements of the expansion rate of matter, explains how the universe expanded from a very high density and high temperature state, and it offers a comprehensive explanation of an abundance of observed phenomena, such as the cosmic background, microwave radiation, the large-scale structure of the universe, and so on. The theistic explanation of the origins of the universe, by contrast, just says some intelligent agent did something at some time, somewhere, somehow, to bring the universe into existence. Ditto with regard to the fine-tuning. In that case, as well, the theistic explanation amounts to little more than the assertion that God did it. No account is given as to the mechanism by means of which this is supposed to have happened. There's no specification of any law or rule in accordance with which God acts, nor is any account given of how an unembodied mind could causally interact with the physical world in the first place. I mean, you can utter the words, God caused the fine-tuning, or God grounds the existence of objective moral values, but I don't think theists really know what they're saying when they make statements like that about divine agency. How does God, as an unembodied mind, causally interact with the physical world? A good explanation is also consistent with our background knowledge, that is, with what we already know. So is theism consistent with our background knowledge? Well, as far as we know, affecting changes in the physical universe requires having a body. So seeking to explain moral objectivity or the fine-tuning of the universe in terms of the creative designs of an unembodied mind is arguably inconsistent with this piece of background knowledge. Indeed, the very idea of an unembodied mind is arguably inconsistent with our background knowledge that having a mind requires having a brain. Another thing scientists look for in a physical theory is predictive power. That's to say, they take their hypothesis and ask what we would expect the world to look like, or what observations we'd expect to make if the hypothesis were true. Well, are there any specific predictions that come out of the theistic hypothesis? Well, I don't think there are. Because God is omnipotent, he could do anything. And because he's mysterious and his purposes are unfathomable and so on, literally any observed state of affairs is consistent with the hypothesis. I mean, he's omnipotent, so there's nothing he can't do. So the range of possible actions that he might perform or changes in the material world that he might affect isn't constrained by what he's capable of doing. But nor can we say that the range of possible actions that he might perform or events that he'd allow to occur is constrained by what he desires, because his mind is supposedly unfathomable. And even if we say his mind isn't unfathomable, and that we know, for example, that he's morally perfect and all-loving, so will only allow things to happen that are good for us, well, that's compatible with just about any observed state of affairs, because, as we've seen in Dr. Craig's response to the argument from pointless evil, it will always be possible to say that of any instance of horrific suffering, that it is, contrary to appearances, necessary for the achievement of an outweighing good or the prevention of a greater evil. So theism doesn't entail any specific predictions, and when you put it like that, the God hypothesis starts to look like a paradigmatically bad explanation. Well, what about the fine-tuning argument? The first thing that I'd like to say here is that I think it's implausible to claim that the initial conditions of the universe were set up specifically in order to make intelligent life possible. The claim isn't that the initial conditions were set up in order to make human life possible. The claim is that the initial conditions were set up to make intelligent life possible. Now, I think that's implausible, given that by far the greatest part of the universe is dark, unimaginably cold, and utterly inhospitable to life. And the universe is almost entirely empty space. On current estimates, the total amount of matter in the universe makes up a tiny fraction of 1% of everything that exists in the universe. The common metaphor that we're like specks of dust is actually an insult to specks of dust. Seen in this context, the suggestion that the universe exists in order for intelligent life to exist is manifestly absurd. The second point I'd like to make relates to Dr. Craig's critique of the multiverse hypothesis. You'll remember that the fine-tuning argument presupposes that there's only one actual universe with one set of values for the fundamental constants, but it might be the case that there are, in fact, multiple universes with a wide range of values for the constants. So the multiverse hypothesis is supposed to make fine-tuning unsurprising via an argument along these sorts of lines. Since universes of practically all relevant types, both tuned and untuned, exist, it's unsurprising that some universe of our finely tuned type exists. And Dr. Craig's main argument against the multiverse hypothesis as an explanation of fine-tuning was that the multiverse leads to the Boltzmann brane problem. Now, Dr. Craig is absolutely right that Boltzmann branes pose a problem for the multiverse hypothesis, but as the cosmologist Sean Carroll pointed out in his debate with Dr. Craig in 2014, there are alternative viable models of the universe, of the multiverse, which avoid the Boltzmann brane problem. I mean, Dr. Craig gave the impression that all multiverse models lead to the Boltzmann brane problem, but that simply isn't the case. And so until he's explained why any of the alternative models, why none of the alternative models is viable, his rejection of the multiverse hypothesis is unwarranted.
Thank you. I invite Dr. Craig for the second rebuttal.
Before we look at my specific arguments for God's existence, let me respond to Dr. Keim's claim that God doesn't explain anything. Notice that some of my arguments are deductive. That is to say, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow, whether you like it or not. For example, the argument from the beginning of the universe, or the argument from the existence of objective moral values. So that it doesn't matter whether you think it's explanatory or not, as long as the premises are true, the conclusion logically follows. And I think that in both cases the premises are true. Concerning the resurrection of Jesus, I think that this hypothesis passes the standard tests for inductive explanations, such as explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, and so forth. God is of the order of a personal explanation. I am not offering alternative scientific theories for the origin of the universe or the fine-tuning. God is a personal explanation, and this is a legitimate form of explanation. Now let's look specifically at the question of the origin of the universe. Here, I didn't understand what Dr. Kame's response was. He doesn't deny that the universe began to exist. He doesn't deny that if the universe began to exist, there is a transcendent cause. All he asked was, well, what about naturalistic explanations? Well, there aren't any if the universe had an absolute beginning. Paul Davies writes, what caused the Big Bang? One might consider some supernatural force, some agency beyond space and time as being responsible for the Big Bang, or one might prefer to regard the Big Bang as an event without a cause. It seems to me that we don't have too much choice. Either something outside the physical world or an event without a cause. But for something to come into existence from nothing is worse than magic, literally. So it seems to me much more plausible to think that there is a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and personal creator of the universe, just as I argued. Now, with respect to the fine-tuning argument, Dr. Kame raises a number of objections. He says there's no account of the mechanism of the designer creating the world. Right, it's a personal explanation, a metaphysical explanation, not a scientific explanation. And design is a very familiar and common form of explanation for phenomena in life that we are called upon to explain. He says, but there can not be an unembodied person. Well, I'd like to see him prove that. We're acquainted with ourselves, I think, as incorporeal, immaterial selves connected to a body. Reductive materialism doesn't work because moral properties are not identical with physical properties. For example, the brain is not sad or jubilant. And epiphenomenalism, or the view that the physical brain has mental properties, is incompatible with such phenomena as self-identity over time, intentional states, freedom of the will, and mental causation. So I think the best view of ourselves is some sort of dualism, interactionism, and I don't see any reason to think that if we are spiritual substances, souls in effect, or minds, that there cannot be a soul without a body. In fact, my arguments, if sound, prove that there is an unembodied mind, a transcendent unembodied mind who created and designed the universe and is the source of moral values. Thirdly, Dr. Kame says that the design hypothesis is implausible because the universe is mostly empty. Well, I have 3 points in response to this. Number one, it's no part of the fine-tuning argument to say that human beings are the reason the universe was created. There could be conscious, intelligent life scattered throughout the cosmos. That's perfectly consistent with the argument. Secondly, in fact, the universe has to be as big as it is. It's a function of human life on this planet. In order for the stars to cook up the heavy elements of which our bodies are composed, the universe has to be as old as it is. But given that it's expanding, it therefore has to be as large as it is. And therefore, the size of the universe is actually a function of the existence of human beings. Thirdly, however, suppose God wants to create a magnificent, large universe rather than a little universe. Suppose he wants to display his infinite glory and power. Who's to say he wouldn't do such a thing? The Bible says the heavens tell the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. I don't see any reason to think that if God exists, he has to create a little universe. Finally, Dr. Kame says that the multiverse hypothesis is defensible. I disagree. Postulating the existence of many worlds doesn't do anything to explain why we observe a world fine-tuned for embodied interactive agents. Unless you can prove that the vast preponderance of observable worlds are worlds that are finely tuned. But that can't be shown. There are observable worlds, like the Boltzmann brane world, which are not finely tuned. And so I do not think that the multiverse explanation succeeds. In order to prove the multiverse explanation, as Robin Collins points out, the detractor would have to show that there is a probability measure over different worlds in the multiverse that means that a significant proportion of the observable worlds are finely tuned worlds, and that simply cannot be done. So it seems to me that, again, the fine-tuning of the universe is best explained by design. If Dr. Kame doesn't think it's design, what's he going to defend? Physical necessity? Chance? He's not offered any reason to think that those alternatives are more plausible than the design hypothesis. Finally, what about the moral argument for God's existence? Here I want to emphasize the need of an explanation in morality. Paul Kurtz, the humanist philosopher, has said, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral? And I cannot see any explanation on atheism for an ontological grounding of moral values. These non-theistic ethical theories that he speaks of typically just begin with the assumption that human beings have intrinsic moral value. And given that assumption, one can then work out an ethical system with which the theist will largely agree. But on atheism, that assumption seems questionable. Machines don't have intrinsic moral worth. But on the atheistic view, that's all we are, just biological machines. As one naturalist puts it, moist robots. And so I don't see any reason to regard human beings as a source of objective moral values. It's arbitrary and implausible. It's especially difficult to find any basis for moral duty in the absence of God.
Thank you very much. And I go for the second one.
Okay, I'd like to say something briefly about the argument from religious experience. Dr. Craig admits that this isn't an argument for theism. Well, if it's not an argument, then don't say it. I mean, it doesn't have any place in a debate on the existence of God, and it has no more epistemic weight in the discussion than my saying that I have a powerful and overwhelming sense of God's absence in the world. Dr. Craig maintains that the person to whom God reveals himself, or for the person to whom God reveals himself, that person can know with complete confidence that theism is true because of the witness that the Holy Spirit bears to him. Well, the problem is that there's just no way of knowing whether such an experience really is veridical. Dr. Craig maintains that some kinds of experience are just so powerful and overwhelming that the subject requires no confirmation of the reliability of the experience. But of course, that feeling of indubitability can also accompany dreams, hallucinations, and psychotic delusions. And so it utterly fails to provide any kind of epistemic warrant. It's also, of course, the case that people of all faiths report religious experience of the kind that Dr. Craig describes. But since these faiths are mutually incompatible, that's to say only one of them can be true, it follows that the felt indubitability of the experience is misleading in at least all but one case. And that means that for anyone who is subject of such an experience, that they have very good reasons to be skeptical that it's veridical. I also think that religious experience is an implausible candidate for a properly basic belief. A properly basic belief, like our belief in the reality of the physical world or the existence of other minds, is a belief that's universal among psychologically healthy human beings, and it's a belief that it's impossible sincerely to doubt. But of course, religious belief isn't like that at all. Religious belief is neither universal among human beings nor impossible to doubt. Plenty of people don't believe in God, and even the most committed religious believers can go through periods of doubt. Religious believers lose their faith as well, but psychologically healthy people don't lose their belief in the reality of the external world or the existence of other minds. One more comment about the moral argument that I'd like to make. The main problem with this argument is, as I've said, the first premise: if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. Now that claim is logically equivalent to the claim that God is the only possible ontological foundation for objective moral values. As I said in my first rebuttal, in making this claim, Dr. Craig is out of step with the vast majority of contemporary moral philosophers who hold that moral objectivity doesn't depend on God. What's more, we've not been given any real argument as to why this extremely controversial claim that objective moral values are impossible without God is true. But not only has Dr. Craig failed to demonstrate that without God, objective moral values and duties are impossible, nor has he explained how objective moral values and duties could be grounded in God in the first place. The account of the relationship that's supposed to obtain between God and objective moral values that Dr. Craig has outlined in his podcast and in his published writings is that objective moral values and duties are rooted in God's nature. God, Dr. Craig says, is the standard of goodness. His character is the paradigm of goodness, and his commands are expressions of his divine nature. Well, we might accept that these commands flow necessarily from God's nature, but we can still ask why commands that flow from God's nature, rather than anyone else's, should be seen as constitutive of morality. What's so special about God? What is it about God's nature such that the commands that flow from it are morality constituting? Sure, God is much more powerful, has much more knowledge than any human agent, but those facts, that he has those attributes to a greater degree than any human agent, shed no light whatsoever on why his commands should be constitutive of morality. God also has a very special metaphysical status, of course. He's creator and sustainer of the universe, but how is that supposed to be morally relevant? In short, what's missing from Dr. Craig's account is an account of the morality constituting force of God's nature. What about the Kalam cosmological argument? First of all, a comment on premise one, the claim that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, Dr. Craig offers a variety of reasons in support of this premise. He says that it's based on a metaphysical intuition, that something can't just pop into being from nothing. But I don't think that's so much an argument for the claim that everything that begins to exist has a cause as simply a reiteration of the claim. That's to say that nothing comes into being from nothing is really just equivalent to saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if it's equivalent to that, then it's not non-question begging. So that's not really an argument in support of the first premise, but rather simply a restatement of the premise. Dr. Craig also says in support of the first premise that the idea that things can just pop into existence is worse than magic. Well, I think that's a strange proposition for a theist to appeal to, since the theistic explanation of the origins of the universe in terms of God's willing the universe to exist is, of course, itself just a type of magic. And in any case, that something could come from nothing is no more mysterious to me than that all the matter and energy in the universe could be brought into existence by an unembodied immaterial mind. What about premise two, that the universe began to exist? Well, this might indeed be true, but Dr. Craig treats this premise as though it were a settled debate in contemporary cosmology, which it certainly isn't. There are numerous models which don't imply an absolute beginning of the universe, and of those, many don't require a cause. Now, Dr. Craig cites the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem as his main piece of scientific evidence for the truth of this premise, and he quotes Alex Vilenkin, one of the authors of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, who does indeed hold that the universe probably had a beginning. But what do the other authors of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem think? Do they hold that the theorem entails that the universe had a beginning? Well, in order to find out, a few days ago I sent Alan Guth an email in which I asked him, does the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, in his opinion, entail that the universe had a beginning? And his response was, quote, I think that the BGV theorem does not entail that the universe had a beginning. It is the region of inflation that must have a beginning, not the universe. All I want to say about that is that if one of the authors of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem holds that it doesn't prove that the universe had a beginning, then that provides good reasons for being skeptical that it does. And since the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem is the main reason Dr. Craig offers for accepting this first premise, that skepticism carries over to Dr. Craig's premise as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so now we come to the closing section of the debate, and I invite Dr. Craig to make his closing remarks.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed the debate this evening as much as I have. Certainly there's been a very interesting airing of the issues. First, consider my first contention that there are good reasons to believe that God exists. Number one, the origin of the universe. Here, Dr. Kames seems to be willing to embrace the view that the universe sprang into being out of nothing, which I think is metaphysically absurd. He says, if theism is like magic, well then that reinforces my point that atheism is worse than magic. According to theism, there is an efficient cause of the origin of the universe, but no material cause. On atheism, there is neither an efficient nor a material cause, which strikes me as doubly absurd. He says the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem does not require a beginning of the universe. I simply disagree, and if he thinks that it doesn't, then I invite him to give me a successful beginningless model of the universe. Alexander Vilenkin in 2012 writes that there are no models at this time that provide a satisfactory model for a universe without a beginning. In the fall of 2015, he strengthened that statement. We have no viable models of an eternal universe. The Borguth-Vilenkin theorem gives reason to believe that such models simply cannot be constructed. And in any case, don't forget the philosophical arguments that I gave against the infinitude of the past, which do not rely upon scientific information. So I think we've got good grounds for believing that the universe is not past eternal, as atheists have always claimed, but came into being a finite time ago, which points to a transcendent personal creator. Secondly, as for the fine-tuning argument, I answered Dr. Kames' objections concerning an unembodied personal cause, the size of the universe, the multiverse, and he did not respond to any of my points in my last speech. I think the fine-tuning argument, therefore, goes through successfully for a designer. As for the moral argument for God's existence, I emphasize the importance of having an ontological foundation that is adequate for morality. And he asked, well, what is so special about God in this regard? God is a better explanation for objective moral values and duties because stopping with God is less arbitrary and it is more plausible than just stopping with human beings. God is metaphysically ultimate, whereas human beings on atheism are just electrochemical machines that don't seem to have intrinsic moral value. Moreover, God is a more plausible candidate for the explanatory ultimate because God is by definition a being who is worthy of worship and therefore must be perfectly good. Indeed, as the greatest conceivable being, God would be the good rather than just be good. So that I think that theism provides a far more plausible and less arbitrary foundation for the affirmation of the objective moral values and duties we both want to affirm. Number 4, unfortunately in tonight's debate, the resurrection of Jesus has gone undiscussed. That gives good reason for thinking Christian theism is true. As for the experience of belief in God, Dr. Kames says, how do you know it's veridical? The point is that you are justified in believing your experience is veridical unless and until you have a defeater of that experience. And we haven't heard any such defeater tonight. We've heard no reason to think that believers are delusory in their religious experience. He says, but it cannot be a properly basic belief because it doesn't have marks of universality and so forth. Properly basic beliefs include a wide range of beliefs, such as memory beliefs or beliefs based on testimony. And therefore, having belief in God in a properly basic way, it seems to me, is quite legitimate. God can be known simply through personal experience. My second contention was that there aren't comparably good arguments for atheism. We talked about the hiddenness of God, and I explained that God's purpose is not simply to make us add another item of furniture to our ontological inventory, but to bring us to know him. And the atheist would have to show that in a world in which God's existence was more obvious, more people would come to a saving knowledge of God, which is just pure conjecture. As for the problem of evil, I showed that neither the logical version goes through, and the Dr. Kame's version of the probabilistic argument from evil was actually logically fallacious and makes a misstep in probability theory. So in conclusion, I do not think we've seen comparably good arguments for atheism, whereas we have good plausibility arguments for theism, and that is why I am enthusiastically and unapologetically a Christian theist.
Thank you. And I pull up, and I would like Dr. Kane.
Okay, so I'd like to finish this evening by saying something about the burden of proof, where I think it lies in the discussion. So I've presented two arguments in tonight's debate for atheism, but in fact I don't think I was under any obligation to present any argument, since the burden of proof in this discussion lies entirely with the theist. Now, Dr. Craig would maintain that the burden of proof is shared equally by the atheist, since the atheist claims to know something. He claims to know that God doesn't exist, and therefore atheism, like theism, is a truth claim and so requires justification. Well, I agree that atheism is a truth claim and so requires justification, but the justification of a belief can take different forms. And sometimes a belief can be justified by demonstrating simply that the evidence for its falsehood is insufficient. So take, for example, my belief that werewolves don't exist. I don't have a proof that werewolves don't exist. Does that mean that my belief that werewolves don't exist is unjustified? Does that mean that I should be agnostic about the existence of werewolves? Well, obviously not. Even though I don't have a sound argument for the non-existence of werewolves, I'm well within my epistemic rights to believe that werewolves don't exist. Well, how can this be the case? Well, the lack of evidence for the existence of werewolves is itself the justification of my belief. If there's no reason to believe in werewolves, that is reason to believe that werewolves don't exist. Well, in reply to that sort of argument, Dr. Craig quotes the following slogan: "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." And he sometimes spells this out in terms of a legal analogy. So the fact that the suspect's fingerprints are not on the murder weapon is not itself evidence that the suspect isn't the murderer. Indeed, the complete absence of evidence doesn't mean that the suspect isn't the murderer. Now, that is, of course, true. The complete absence of evidence is logically compatible with the suspect being the murderer. But the question isn't what is logically compatible with a complete absence of evidence. The question is what it's rational to believe in the complete absence of evidence. And from the complete absence of evidence that the suspect is the murderer, two things follow about what it's rational to believe about the suspect. Firstly, it follows that it's not rational to believe that the suspect is guilty, and secondly, it follows that it's rational to believe that the suspect is innocent. So similarly, in respect of belief in God, in the complete absence of any compelling evidence, that is, if none of the arguments for God's existence is, in the final analysis, successful, then it follows that firstly, it's not rational to believe that God exists, and secondly, it's rational to believe that God doesn't exist. Now, Dr. Craig is prepared to admit that in certain contexts, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, and he stipulates two conditions under which absence of evidence is evidence of absence. The first condition is that we fully examine the area where the evidence should be found, and the second condition is that if the entity did exist, then we'd expect to have more evidence of its existence than that which we have. Now, it seems to me that that just amounts to tacit acceptance that the theist bears the burden of proof. If we translate the first condition, that we fully examined the area where the evidence should be found, to the question of the existence of God, as Dr. Craig himself says, that will mean you have done a thorough and in-depth investigation of the arguments of natural theology for God's existence. In other words, for the first condition to be met, the atheist must have thoroughly assessed the arguments for God's existence. What about the second condition? Well, here, when it's translated to the question of God's existence, this means that, quote, if God existed, we should have more evidence of his existence than that which we do have. And Dr. Craig then asks, is that true? If there were a God, we have more evidence of his existence than the existence of a contingent universe, the beginning of the universe at some point in the finite past, the fine-tuning of the universe, and so on. Should we have more evidence than that, he asks? Well, obviously the answer to that question is going to depend on how persuasive you find all these arguments. If you can show that these arguments are in fact unsound, then clearly the answer is going to be yes, we should have more evidence than that. So it's possible for the atheist to satisfy both conditions, and therefore for it to be the case that with respect to God's existence, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. And that means that on Dr. Craig's own account, the burden of proof lies exclusively with the theist. In any case, I provided two arguments for atheism in tonight's debate, even though I didn't need to, and I actually don't think we've heard a convincing response to either of them from Dr. Craig this evening. I've argued that the existence of non-resistant non-believers is incompatible with the existence of an omnipotent, perfectly loving being, and I've argued that given that it's more probable than not that there are pointless evils in the world, it's more probable than not that God doesn't exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now it's time.